No one asks a Mafia boss for safety. They ask for mercy, for time, for forgiveness on debts that might cost them everything. But when Rita Manna reached for Umberto Lorenzo's coat that November morning, she wasn't asking for a favor. She was exposing a trafficking operation that had been hunting children at school crosswalks for 3 years, and the men watching from across the street knew they'd just been caught. What happened next would prove that some lines can never be crossed, even in a city built on violence and silence. Umberto Lorenzo was stepping out of his black town car when she reached for his coat. "Sir," she said quietly, steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Can you walk me to school today? I need to feel safe." His entire crew went still. His driver's hand froze on the door handle. Even the morning traffic seemed to pause mid-route. No one asked Umberto Lorenzo for safety. People asked him for extensions on debts they couldn't pay, for mercy on mistakes that might cost them everything, for protection that came with prices they'd spend years repaying. But never this. Never a child asking for something this simple and this impossible. He knelt slowly, his voice dropping to something almost gentle. "Why don't you feel safe, Piccola?" Rita hesitated, then turned slightly, her gaze directing his attention across the street. 2 men stood near a delivery van, pretending to check their phones. But their eyes weren't on their screens. They were locked on her. One of them smiled when he noticed Umberto looking. The kind of smile that held no warmth, only recognition. Umberto's pulse kicked once, sharp and cold, because he knew exactly what he was looking at. Scouts. Surveillance patterns. The careful, patient methodology of traffickers identifying targets near school zones. Men whose business the Mafia itself refused to touch. The little girl's voice broke through his calculations. "They've been watching me for days. I just want to get to school without them following me today." Umberto Lorenzo stood up, and what he did next in broad daylight on a quiet industrial crosswalk in front of half-awake commuters and security cameras would fracture alliances, ignite a territorial war, and force an entire city to choose sides before the week ended. Stay with me until the end, because the truth behind that little girl's fear and the choice Umberto made will change everything you think you know about power, protection, and the cost of doing what's right when no one else will. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. Her name was Rita Manna, 6 years old. Born in the heart of the city's forgotten industrial district, where children learn to walk with their heads down and speak even quieter, where single guardians worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. Rita lived with her aunt, Elga Manna, in a third-floor walk-up above a closed laundromat on Meridian Street. Her parents had died 18 months earlier in an apartment fire. The kind of fire that started from old wiring and spread too fast for sleeping families to escape. The kind of tragedy that made headlines for 2 days, then disappeared beneath the city's endless scroll of emergencies. Elga was 34. Night shift nurse at the public hospital, chronic exhaustion written in the lines around her eyes, a paycheck so stretched that groceries and utilities existed in rotation, never together. She loved Rita with everything she had left. But love doesn't stop predators from hunting. For 2 weeks, Rita had been trying to tell her aunt about the men. How they appeared at the crosswalk every morning. How they watched her from their parked cars with windows tinted just enough to hide their faces, but not their intent. "They're always there, Aunt Gabby," Rita had whispered one evening, pushing pasta around her plate. "They don't talk to me. But they watch. Like they're waiting for something." Elga had called the school twice. Principal Theodore listened, took notes, promised to mention it to the crossing guard. But without evidence of direct contact or specific threats, there wasn't much the school could do. The police precinct secretary had been equally sympathetic and equally useless. "We can't investigate people for standing on public streets." But Rita knew what she felt. The kind of knowing that lives in your stomach, not your head. This particular morning, November 12th, Rita had woken to an empty apartment. Elga's overnight shift had turned into a double when another nurse called in sick. The note on the refrigerator was written in her aunt's rushed handwriting, "Emergency at work. Lock door. Be careful." Rita ate her cereal standing up. She locked the door carefully, checking it twice. She adjusted her pink backpack, took a breath, and stepped into the cold morning air. She saw them immediately. The same black sedan. The same two men, not hiding anymore. This time, they weren't pretending to look at phones. They were staring directly at her. Waiting. One of them took a step toward the crosswalk when the light changed. Rita's feet locked in place. Her breath caught. She looked back at her building, but the windows were dark. She looked toward the school, 6 blocks away through empty industrial streets. That's when the black town car pulled up to the curb. Umberto Lorenzo, 43 years old. Third-generation organized crime. A man who controlled shipping routes, construction permits, and enough political connections to make investigations disappear before they started. But Umberto had one rule that separated him from every other operator in the city's criminal network. One line he'd drawn decades ago that had cost him partnerships, territory, and respect from men who thought profit trumped principles. Children were untouchable. Not just his own godchildren. All children. Anyone who exploited a child, trafficked a child, harmed a child in any way, answered to Umberto personally. This rule had cost him millions. Trafficking routes he'd turned down. Drug operations he wouldn't fund. Partnerships he'd refused outright. When Rita Manor reached for his coat that morning, Umberto saw something that made his blood run ice cold. Pure terror in a child's eyes. The kind of fear that meant someone was seconds away from doing something unforgivable. "Can you walk me to school today? I need to feel safe." Umberto followed her gesture across the street. He recognized the pattern immediately. Scouts. Traffickers. Men operating in his territory, hunting near a school, targeting a child who just asked him for protection. His driver, Albano, glanced at his watch. "Boss, the meeting with the Port Authority." Umberto didn't look up. His attention was on Rita. "What's your name, Piccola?" "Rita Manor. I live with my Aunt Elga." "And those men, how long have they been watching you?" 2 weeks. Every morning." Umberto stood slowly. The men across the street were armed. Probably had backup. This was a public street with witnesses, cameras, parents driving their children to school. But there are some moments that don't wait for perfect conditions. He looked down at Rita. This brave little girl who'd chosen to ask the most dangerous man in the district for help because every safe adult in her life had failed her. Umberto Lorenzo made a decision that would shatter decades of carefully maintained boundaries and collapse alliances that had held for generations. He took Rita's small hand in his large one. Then he made direct eye contact with the men across the street. Held it. Let them see exactly who she was with now. And he began walking toward the school. What Umberto didn't know was that by the time he reached those school gates, 3 children in neighboring districts would already be missing, and on his desk would be photographs of Rita laughing at recess with a message written in block letters. "You chose one." Rita Manor learned how to be invisible the night the fire took her parents. She was 4 years old when she woke to smoke filling her bedroom, when firefighters carried her down 3 flights of stairs wrapped in a blanket, when social workers spoke in soft voices about trauma and adjustment periods and finding appropriate placement. She learned quickly that crying made adults uncomfortable, that asking questions made them exchange glances, that being small and quiet and easy meant you didn't get moved again. Her Aunt Elga wasn't cruel. She was just drowning, working 60-hour weeks to cover rent in a city that didn't care if you were tired or broken or doing your best. Rita understood this without anyone explaining it. She made herself breakfast. She did her homework without being asked. She learned to read the signs when her aunt was too exhausted to talk, when silence was kindness instead of neglect. But being invisible has a cost. When Rita told her first-grade teacher, Ms. Nancy, about the men watching her, Ms. Nancy smiled sympathetically and suggested Rita might be processing grief through hypervigilance. When she told the school counselor, Mr. Marion, he nodded thoughtfully and recommended anxiety management techniques for young children. No one asked for descriptions. No one requested details. No one believed that a 6-year-old could accurately identify a threat that adults had been trained to miss. The system designed to protect her chose procedure over instinct, forms over fear, rational explanation over a child's desperate warning. Rita stopped trying to make them understand. She just walked faster, checked over her shoulder more often, counted the days until someone finally listened. Umberto Lorenzo recognized the pattern the moment Rita pointed across the street. He'd seen this surveillance methodology twice before. Once in a port district 8 years ago, where traffickers had identified targets through after-school programs. Once in a residential neighborhood where they'd posed as maintenance workers to map children's routines. Both times, Umberto had shut down the operations through intermediaries. Quiet threats delivered to the right people. Financial pressure applied to landlords who looked the other way. He'd never needed to get directly involved. But this was different. This was his territory. His crosswalk. A child asking him for protection in broad daylight. The men across the street weren't amateurs. Their positioning was deliberate. Their patience indicated organization. They'd been tracking Rita long enough to know her routine, her guardian schedule, her vulnerability. Umberto's instinct was to end this immediately. One phone call and those men would disappear before lunch. Clean. Efficient. Invisible. But as he watched them watching Rita, Umberto understood something crucial. Fear thrived in silence. Predators operated in the gaps between what people noticed and what they chose to ignore. Visibility was the weapon they feared most. His rule about children hadn't come from morality or strategy. It had come from a moment 30 years ago that he'd never spoken about. A choice he'd failed to make. A consequence he'd carried ever since. Some debts couldn't be repaid. They could only be honored through every decision that came after. Umberto looked down at Rita's small hand in his, then back at the men across the street who were slowly realizing their operation had just been exposed. He could make them disappear quietly. Or he could make sure every parent, every witness, every camera in this district saw exactly what happened when someone threatened a child under his protection. Umberto Lorenzo made his choice, and it started with one very public walk to school. They walked slowly. Umberto matched Rita's pace exactly, his shadow covering her completely in the early morning light. His hand remained gentle on hers, but his presence was anything but soft. Traffic slowed. Then stopped. A delivery truck idled at the intersection, the driver's window rolling down. A woman in a sedan pulled to the curb, phone forgotten in her lap, watching. A man walking his dog stood frozen on the sidewalk. Everyone knew who Umberto Lorenzo was. Everyone knew what it meant to see him walking a 6-year-old girl to school at 8 in the morning on Meridian Street. Rita felt the fear in her chest begin to loosen. Not disappear, just shift. She wasn't invisible anymore. The weight of Umberto's protection surrounded her like armor she hadn't known existed. Above them, curtains moved. Windows opened. Phones rose, recording. Parents who normally dropped their children at the curb and drove away now stepped out of their cars, watching, witnessing. Across the street, the two men who'd been tracking Rita for 2 weeks stood perfectly still. Their confident posture evaporated. One reached for his phone. The other glanced toward their vehicle. They'd planned for a vulnerable child walking alone. They hadn't planned for this. For Umberto Lorenzo, making their operation visible to an entire neighborhood. Without a word exchanged, without a threat delivered, the men retreated. Back to their van. Engines starting. Tires pulling away from the curb too quickly. Umberto didn't watch them leave. His attention stayed on Rita. They reached the school gates 6 minutes later. Other children were arriving now, parents walking them in, teachers greeting students at the entrance. Rita's teacher, Ms. Nancy, stood near the doorway, her clipboard lowered, staring. Umberto stayed. Didn't leave when Rita reached the gates. Didn't leave when she waved goodbye. He stood there, visible, unmistakable, until the bell rang. Until every child was inside. Until the doors closed and locked. Only then did he turn back toward his car. By lunchtime, the story had spread through 3 school districts. By afternoon, it had reached the police precincts, the mayor's office, the criminal networks that operated in careful silence. A mafia boss walking a child to school. Umberto Lorenzo protecting a 6-year-old orphan from traffickers in broad daylight. Some called it theater. Others called it war. That evening, when Umberto returned to his office, 3 photographs were waiting on his desk, and the message beneath them made his blood run cold. 3 children. 3 districts. All taken this afternoon. You chose 1. We chose 3. Umberto spent the next 18 hours pulling every thread he could reach. Surveillance footage from businesses near the 3 districts where children vanished. License plates cross-referenced with Port Authority records. Phone intercepts from contacts who operated in the gray spaces between legal and criminal. The investigation moved quietly, methodically, through channels that didn't appear in police reports. What emerged wasn't random violence. It was infrastructure. The trafficking network operated like a corporation. School routes mapped for vulnerability. Families profiled for isolation. Single parents, working doubles, elderly guardians, recent immigrants. Children identified through patience and observation, then extracted during precise windows when no one was watching. They used fear and invisibility as tools. Parents who reported suspicious behavior found themselves investigated instead. Teachers who raised concerns were quietly reassigned. The network had been operating for 3 years, and they'd perfected the art of remaining unseen. Umberto recognized the methodology. 5 years ago, they'd approached him with a partnership proposal. Access to port shipping routes in exchange for territorial silence. He'd refused. Twice more they'd returned with better offers, more profit, cleaner operations. Each time Umberto had said no, and each time they'd accepted his refusal without retaliation. Until now. Boss, this is a mistake. Marcello stood across from Umberto's desk, arms crossed. You made this visible. They responded. This escalates into a war we can't control. 3 children, Umberto said quietly, studying the photographs. Taken in coordinated strikes within hours of each other. They're not warning me. They're showing me their reach. Exactly, Marcello pressed. They're proving you can't protect everyone. Walk away from this. Protect your territory, your operations, your people. Don't make this bigger than it needs to be. Umberto looked up. They took children because I walked one girl to school. They took children because you made it public. Because you showed weakness. I showed a line. And they're showing you that your line doesn't matter. Umberto stood slowly, walking to the window overlooking the industrial district. Lights flickering on as evening settled. Families returning home. Children finishing homework. A city operating in careful ignorance of what moved beneath its streets. Set up a meeting, Umberto said. Everyone in our network. Tomorrow night. I want every lieutenant, every crew chief, every operator who works in this city. To say what? That we're going to war. Not for territory. Not for profit. For every school route, every crosswalk, every place where children should feel safe. Marcello's voice dropped. Boss, half our people will walk out. Then they walk. Umberto turned back to the photographs on his desk. 3 children. 3 families destroyed in a single afternoon. A message written clearly, your protection means nothing. But what the traffickers didn't understand was that Umberto Lorenzo had already made his choice the moment Rita reached for his coat, and some wars weren't about winning, they were about drawing lines that could never be erased. Across the city, in a warehouse that didn't appear on any municipal records, 5 men were making their own calculations about how to break a mafia boss who'd forgotten that sentiment was a weakness, and their next message would be written in a language even Umberto couldn't ignore. The news broke at 6 a.m. 3 children. 3 districts. All vanished between school dismissal and dinner time. No witnesses. No surveillance footage. No ransom demands. 7-year-old Charlie Smith, last seen leaving his after-school program in the warehouse district. 9-year-old Clementina Loggia, disappeared from a bus stop 3 blocks from her apartment. 5-year-old Stephen Dugas, gone from his grandmother's front yard while she went inside to answer the phone. The city woke to chaos. Parents who'd sent their children to school that morning now stood in police stations, voices breaking, hands shaking, demanding answers that didn't exist. News vans circled the neighborhoods. Reporters interviewed neighbors who'd seen nothing, heard nothing, noticed nothing until it was already too late. Umberto watched the coverage from his office, each news report landing like a physical blow. He knew what the police didn't. This wasn't random. It was surgical. 3 families identified for their vulnerability. 3 children taken during precise windows of opportunity. 3 districts just beyond Umberto's traditional territory. The message was deliberate. Your protection has boundaries. We don't. By noon, a courier delivered a manila envelope to Umberto's office. No return address. No note. Just photographs. Rita laughing during recess, her pink backpack beside her on a bench. Rita crossing Meridian Street that morning, Umberto's hand holding hers. Rita entering the school building, turning back to wave. And beneath the photos, typed in block letters, she's safe because you chose her. 3 others aren't because you didn't. How many more will you sacrifice for one? Umberto stared at the images for a long time. He'd protected Rita. Walked her to school. Made a public stand. Done exactly what he'd promised. and 3 children had paid the price for his selective mercy. This was the equation they wanted him to see. Protect 1, lose 3. Protect 10, lose 30. The mathematics of impossible choices. But Umberto understood something the traffickers didn't. They'd made this about territory, about power, about proving that sentiment was weakness. They were wrong. The moment Umberto chose to walk Rita to school, he'd already crossed the line they thought would stop him. He'd already accepted that some wars couldn't be fought halfway. That protecting one child meant protecting all of them, no matter the cost. His phone buzzed. Marcelo's message was brief. Families are calling us. The missing children's families. They're asking for help. Umberto picked up the phone and made the call he'd been planning since the photographs arrived. Emergency meeting. Tonight. Every lieutenant. Every crew chief. Everyone who operates in this city. He paused, his voice hardening. And get me the names of every person connected to those 3 disappearances. Every surveillance camera within 6 blocks. Every vehicle that appeared in more than one location. I want to know who these people are, where they operate, and who's protecting them. Boss, if we go after them. We're already at war, Marcelo. They just don't know they've already lost. Umberto hung up and looked at the photographs one final time before sliding them into his desk drawer, but the image he couldn't shake wasn't Rita's smile or the threatening message. It was the 3 children whose faces were now plastered across every news channel, and the parents who were about to learn that when Umberto Lorenzo made a promise, he kept it, even if it meant burning down every alliance he'd ever built. 23 men filled Umberto's private meeting room that night. Lieutenants who'd worked for him for decades. Crew chiefs who controlled operations across 6 districts. Men who'd built their lives on the understanding that Umberto's word was absolute and his decisions were final. Tonight, half of them would walk out. This is suicide, Ennio said, standing near the back. You're asking us to go to war with a network that operates in 8 cities. For what? 3 kids we don't know. For principal, Umberto said quietly. Principal doesn't pay mortgages. Principal doesn't keep the police off our backs. You make this a crusade, and law enforcement will have the excuse they've been waiting for. They'll come after all of us. Marcelo leaned forward. He's right, boss. The mayor's office is already asking questions. The DA is talking about task forces. You escalate this, and we become the target instead of them. We're already the target, Umberto said. The moment they took those children, they made this about us. About whether we control our territory or whether we let predators operate under our noses. They're not operating under our noses, another voice called out. They're operating in districts we don't control. Districts that aren't our responsibility. Then whose responsibility are they? Umberto's voice cut through the room. The police who take reports and do nothing? The schools that dismiss warnings? The system that tells parents to wait for evidence while their children disappear? Silence. I'm making this clear, Umberto continued. From this point forward, no child in our territory, or any territory we can reach, will be harmed. No trafficking operation will be tolerated. No profit is worth a child's fear. You're breaking every code we've operated under for 30 years, Ennio Lombardi said. The code is already broken, Umberto replied. We just pretended it wasn't. 5 men stood up. Then 3 more. Then another 2. Ennio Lombardi was the last to rise. You're choosing morality over survival. That's not leadership. That's sentiment. Then I'm sentimental." The men walked out without another word. Decade-long partnerships dissolved in seconds. Operations that would need restructuring. Territory that would need reassigning. The cost was immediate and measurable. Umberto looked at the 13 men who remained. "Get me contact information for the families of the 3 missing children. I'm going to visit them personally. No intermediaries. No demands. No prices." "Boss," Marcello said carefully, "if you offer help without asking for anything in return." "I know what it means." It meant breaking the transactional code that had governed organized crime for generations. It meant offering protection without loyalty oaths, resources without repayment, power without strings attached. It meant becoming something the city had never seen before, a criminal who operated outside the logic of crime itself. Umberto stood, and for the first time in 30 years, he felt the weight of his reputation shift from armor into burden. But in the morning, when he knocked on the first family's door, he would no longer be just a mafia boss protecting his territory. He would be a man who'd chosen to rewrite the rules of power itself, and the city would never be the same. The change started small. A father walking his daughter to school the next morning noticed Umberto's men positioned at the crosswalk. Not threatening. Not intimidating. Just present. Visible. He decided to walk his daughter all the way to the gates instead of dropping her at the corner. By the second day, 3 more parents did the same. By the end of the week, the morning school routes had transformed. Parents walking in groups. Store owners standing outside their shops during dismissal hours. Elderly neighbors watching from their windows, phones ready, eyes alert. Fear began to fracture. The invisible agreement that had allowed predators to operate, the silence, the looking away, the assumption that danger was someone else's problem, started crumbling. People who'd never spoken to Umberto Lorenzo, who'd crossed streets to avoid him, now nodded when his men passed. Some even approached, asking how they could help. Volunteer patrols formed. Informal networks of parents sharing school schedules, noting suspicious vehicles, reporting unfamiliar adults lingering near playgrounds. The infrastructure of protection grew organically, spreading beyond Umberto's direct control. The traffickers felt it immediately. Routes that had been reliable became exposed. Surveillance that had been invisible became documented. Operations that had thrived in silence now operated under scrutiny. They pulled back from 3 districts. Then 5. Then 8. But retreat made them dangerous. Law enforcement watched the shift with growing unease. The police chief called Umberto twice, warning him about vigilantism and jurisdiction. The DA issued public statements about criminal elements manipulating community safety concerns. They understood what was happening. Umberto Lorenzo was doing what they'd failed to do, and the city was choosing him over them. Umberto coordinated quietly. Phone calls to his remaining crew. Resources distributed to families who needed them. Information shared with parents about what to watch for. He never asked for loyalty. Never demanded silence. Just offered protection and let people decide what to do with it. Rita noticed the change first. Walking to school now meant passing familiar faces. Mr. Costanzo from the bakery waving from his doorway. Mrs. Arlene standing at the crosswalk with her grandson. Umberto's driver, Albano, parked discreetly at the corner, reading his newspaper but always watching. She smiled more. Not just at Umberto, but at her teachers, her classmates, even her Aunt Elga, who'd stopped working double shifts after someone anonymously paid their rent 3 months forward. Trust was forming. Not just in Umberto, but in the neighborhood itself. On a Tuesday evening, 2 weeks after the 3 children disappeared, 5 men met in the same warehouse where they'd planned their previous message. "He's made this bigger than we anticipated," one said, studying surveillance photos spread across the table. "He's made it personal," another corrected. "That's his weakness." The photographs showed Umberto visiting families. Umberto walking with Rita. Umberto's men at crosswalks across 6 districts. "One final move," the first man said. "Something that proves protection is an illusion. Something that breaks him completely." They slid a new photograph into the center of the table, and when they did, every man in the room understood that the war was about to reach its breaking point, because the target they'd chosen wasn't a random child or a symbolic gesture. It was the one person Umberto Lorenzo had promised to keep safe above all others. They came for Rita on a Thursday afternoon. 2 men in a utility van parked near the school gates at dismissal time, fake work orders on their dashboard, tools arranged to look legitimate. They'd studied her routine for 3 days. Knew she walked with a group of parents for 2 blocks before turning onto Meridian Street. Knew there was a 15-second gap where she'd be out of direct sight. They waited for that gap. But they hadn't counted on Mrs. Arlene. The elderly woman who'd started standing at the crosswalk after Umberto's walk now positioned herself at the exact corner where Rita turned. She saw the van pull forward. Saw the side door open. Saw one man step out with his hand reaching toward his pocket. She didn't hesitate. She screamed, "Rita, run!" Her voice shattered the afternoon quiet. Parents turned. Store owners emerged from doorways. Mr. Costanzo from the bakery dropped his tray and sprinted toward the corner. The man froze, his hand still in his pocket. His partner in the van cursed, engine revving. Albano, Umberto's driver, was already moving. He'd been parked 3 blocks away, but he'd heard Mrs. Arlene scream through the neighborhood network's group text chain. His car screeched around the corner, blocking the van's exit route. Within 60 seconds, 12 people surrounded the utility van. Parents with phones recording. Store owners with baseball bats they'd never had to use. Elderly residents calling police while standing between the van and Rita. The traffickers had planned for invisibility. They hadn't planned for witnesses who refused to look away. Police arrived 4 minutes later. By then, Umberto's men had quietly photographed the van's license plate, the men's faces, and the fake work orders. Evidence that would lead investigators to a warehouse, then to a network, then to names law enforcement had been failing to connect for 3 years. The arrests happened in daylight. News cameras captured everything. The utility van. The fake credentials. The tools that weren't tools. And the community that had stood together to stop something everyone had previously ignored. The traffickers' power didn't collapse from violence. It dissolved from exposure. Within 48 hours, federal investigators had warrants for 8 cities. Within a week, 17 arrests. The network that had operated in silence for years crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny and documented evidence. Rita stood at her apartment window that evening, watching police cars leave her neighborhood. Umberto had visited hours earlier, speaking quietly with her aunt, making sure they understood they were safe now. But Rita had seen something in Umberto's eyes that the adults had missed. Relief, yes. But also exhaustion. The kind that comes from carrying weight no one else can see. She thought about the 3 children who'd been taken. About Charlie Smith. And Clementina Loggia and Stephen Dugas, whose faces still appeared on news broadcasts even though they'd been found and returned to their families. She thought about how many other children might have disappeared if Mrs. Arlene hadn't screamed. If Mr. Costanzo hadn't run. If her neighbors had chosen silence instead of courage. Rita was 6 years old, but she understood something that would shape the rest of her life. Safety wasn't given. It was built by ordinary people making extraordinary choices, and the cost of that safety was measured not just in Umberto's sacrifices, but in a city that had finally decided to see what it had been trained to ignore. What she didn't yet know was that in 6 months, when she turned 7 and started walking to school entirely on her own again, Umberto Lorenzo would still be watching from his car every single morning, because some promises don't end when the danger passes, they become the foundation for everything that comes after. 6 months later, the crosswalk on Meridian Street looked different. Not because anything physical had changed. The same yellow crossing sign still flickered in the morning light. The same traffic light cycled through its familiar rhythm. The same industrial buildings framed the street with their weathered brick facades. But everything had changed. Rita walked to school on her own now. 7 years old, pink backpack replaced with a purple one, shoelaces tied evenly, and eyes that no longer scanned shadows for danger. She walked with her head up, exchanging waves with Mr. Costanzo, who still stood outside his bakery each morning. Mrs. Arlene remained at her corner, though now she smiled instead of watching with tension. Umberto's black town car was still parked 3 blocks away. Same position. Same sight line to the crosswalk. But he no longer stepped out. No longer made himself visible. He just watched, a silent guardian whose presence had become woven into the neighborhood's daily rhythm. This morning, Rita stopped at the crosswalk and looked back. She saw Umberto's car. Saw him behind the wheel, his newspaper folded, his attention on her. She waved. He waved back. Then she did something she hadn't done since that first morning 6 months ago. She walked over to his car. Umberto rolled down the window. "Hi, Mr. Lorenzo." "Buongiorno, Piccola. You're going to be late for school." "I know. I just..." She paused, choosing her words carefully the way children do when they're trying to say something important. "I wanted to say thank you." "For what?" "For walking with me that day. For making it so I'm not scared anymore." Umberto felt something tighten in his chest. He'd dismantled criminal networks, fractured decades-old alliances, and reshaped the balance of power across 6 districts. But this moment, a 7-year-old's simple gratitude, carried more weight than any of it. "You're not scared because you're brave, Rita. You were brave the morning you asked for help." "Maybe. But I think I'm brave now because you showed me I didn't have to be scared alone." She smiled, adjusted her backpack, and ran back to the crosswalk. The light turned green. She crossed with 3 other children, their parents watching from the corner. Safe. Visible. Protected by a community that had learned to see. Umberto watched until she disappeared through the school gates. He thought about that November morning when a 6-year-old girl had reached for his coat with trembling hands. He thought about the choice he'd made. The allies he'd lost. The code he'd broken. The war he'd ignited. And he thought about what had emerged from all of it, a neighborhood where parents walked their children without fear, where witnesses refused to look away, where power had been redirected from profit to protection. One request from one child had rewritten every rule he'd operated under for 30 years. Some people would call it weakness. Sentiment. A mafia boss choosing morality over survival. But as Umberto watched children cross that street, laughing, talking, carrying backpacks too big for their shoulders, he understood something that his former allies never would. The greatest power wasn't controlling territory through fear. It was building something worth protecting. And protection, real protection, wasn't about who you could threaten. It was about who you chose to stand beside when no one else would. Umberto started his car and drove away, knowing he'd return tomorrow morning, and the morning after that, and every morning for as long as it took, because some promises transcend crime and law and reputation. They become the invisible architecture that holds everything else together. And on Meridian Street, in the industrial district where fear had once owned every corner, children now crossed safely to school, carried by the simple truth that when one person decides to see danger and stand against it, they give permission for everyone else to do the same. One 6-year-old girl. One impossible request. One choice that changed everything. Power isn't about who you can control. It's about who you choose to protect when no one else will. If this story moved you, smash that like button and subscribe for more. Drop a comment. What would you have done in Rita's place? Thanks for watching.